a brief introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah McDonough, and I'm the Programs Manager at the Lexington Historical Society. And I would like to thank you so much for joining us this evening for our latest virtual Cronin lecture, which is The Origins of World War II with Dan Breen. We have a number of speakers tonight, as you can see. But before we get to that, I would just like to explain a little bit about what we're doing here tonight. This particular lecture does fall under what we call Cronin lectures here at the Historical Society. And this is a yearly lecture series that was founded to celebrate the birthday of Neil Cronin, the 100th birthday of Neil Cronin, who was a celebrated Lexingtonian who I am told was in the Army in World War II for 3 weeks before being kicked out for being too old. So this was started to celebrate his 100th birthday and has been going ever since. That was in 2003. We're very lucky this year that our lecture series is generously sponsored by Enterprise Bank, so we thank them very much for their support. However, this is just one of many programs that we hold over the course of the year. So any support that you would like to give to us is very greatly appreciated. And just to give a sense of what that might look like, I would like to very briefly share my screen with you and play a video that was made by our Historical Society President, Barry Kuna, who would like to say a few words.
Hello, my name is Barry Kuna, and I'm the president of the Lexington Historical Society. I'm also a member of the Lexington Minutemen. As president of the Historical Society, I am hoping you'll enjoy this presentation. Just as it was for Lexingtonians who faced the challenge of their times in 1775, the Historical Society is facing a challenge today. The Society's income has been severely limited due to the coronavirus pandemic. But many of the expenses associated with preserving our heritage have not diminished. So, like the Minutemen and women of the Revolution, we're counting on you as good citizens and patriots to help us answer the call with your financial assistance. We appreciate your interest and your support, and we hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
So thank you so much for watching that. And before we get to the actual speaking portion of our evening, I'd just like to go over a couple quick housekeeping rules for those who may have not done a Zoom webinar before. If you hover your mouse around the bottom of your screen, you will see what is called a Q&A button. And that is the best place to put questions. We will be able to take questions at the end of our lecture tonight. Feel free to use the chat button as well if you have any stories to share, that sort of thing. But if you do have a question for our speaker, we would ask that you use the Q&A button just so that your question doesn't get lost in any other conversation. Also, as you may have noticed when I shared my screen with you, you most likely saw all of our images, our videos off to the side of your screen. And so once our speaker starts sharing his screen with you to play his PowerPoint presentation, that will happen again. And you do have the option of minimizing all of our lovely faces, or if you would like to click speaker view, you will only see Dan's face on the side of your screen, which is what we recommend. So to get this whole thing going, I would like to introduce our first speaker, George Gamoda, who is the chair of the Lexington Remembers World War II Committee. He is the mastermind behind a much larger series of lectures, of which this is the first. George, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the day. It was a beautiful New England day in May, or first day of June. As Sarah said, my name is George Gamoda, and I'm the chair of the Lexington Remembers World War II Committee. Some of you might remember me from Lexington remembers World War I, but that's another thing that happened 2 years ago. Our mission is basically to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. For a small town of Lexington of some 6,000 people in the 1940s, we send over 1,060 men and women overseas to fight the aggressors to help retain freedom for people around the world. 90 of those people were women. 56, unfortunately, of our fellow Lexingtonians did not make it back. They gave their sacrifice, utmost sacrifice. The committee is trying to collect information on those that served and has a database detailing their lives. Along with the database, we're developing an electronic album that has images of those that served and their history. We encourage all of you who have additional information on World War II veterans to provide it so that we can share it with others and expand our album. Finally, I would like to encourage you to view our collection of oral histories of men and women who lived through the war, overseas and those on the home front. And one of those was Neil Cronin, who is featured in one of the oral histories that we have on our website. All of these stories are available on Lex Media on Demand, as well as the YouTube and our website. I encourage you to look at it. Today's lecture, as Sarah said, is the first in the series we plan to have dealing with World War II. It is a pleasure for me to have Dan Breen here tonight. Many of you might recall that Dan gave us an excellent talk back in 2018 on impact of World War I. So his talk today is a follow-on to that which led up to World War II. Let me now ask Linda Dixon to do this virtual podium, use this virtual podium, and she will introduce Dan on behalf of the Lexington Veterans Association, who is a co-sponsor with the Lexington Historical Society of this Cronin lecture. Linda, please take it over.
Thank you, George. And good evening, everyone. We are just so glad that Zoom has given us the opportunity to hold this lecture and yet stay safe and stay home. Tonight marks the third, as George said, this is the third annual joint sponsorship of the Cronin Lecture by the Lexington Veterans Association and the Lexington Historical Society, and it has been a great partnership. For more than 20 years, the Lexington Veterans Association has hosted a monthly speaker on a military topic at the Cary Library on the second Monday of the month. The programs are free and open to the public, and they have steadily gained in popularity over the years. Tonight's speaker, Dan Breen, is a specialist on military history. He's presented many programs to groups throughout Lexington, and he's always a favorite. After tonight, I am sure you will join the Dan Breen fan club if you are not already a member. Dan Breen grew up in Atlanta, surrounded by Civil War history. Actually, he trained as an attorney, and he practiced law for several years before he realized that history was his real passion. So he went out and earned another master's degree in history from the University of Georgia. And then he came to Boston College for his PhD and stayed. He taught history at Framingham State, Newbury College, and he is now in his present position as senior lecturer, legal studies at Brandeis University. Dan will trace the many factors that contributed to the outbreak of World War II. He feels that the war in the Pacific has not been as well covered or as well understood as the war in Europe. And so he will focus a good deal of his talk on that region. So without further ado, let us welcome Dan Breen. Dan, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Linda. And thank you very much to the Lexington Historical Society in the LBA for making this possible. This is an honor for me to be speaking with you tonight. And let me share my screen and make sure you can all see some of these slides that I'm hoping I'm going to be able to show, having to do with the coming of World War II. So this task tonight is an honor for me to be involved in, but it's also a very big challenge because the Second World War was probably the largest single thing that ever happened in the human annals. And it was also the single greatest man-made disaster in all human history, with nearly 60 million people dead on most of the continents of the earth by the time the war ended in 1945. But it's also a challenge in this respect, in that World War II was really two wars, one of which began in Asia in the fall of 1931, especially in Manchuria, and the other began in Europe and Poland in 1939. And those two wars only came together with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So any talk on the coming of World War II has got to focus on Asia, I think, and Europe. And that's what I'm going to try to do today. And as you'll see along the way, I'm going to suggest that this story has a lot to do with two crucially bad decisions, and I'll be talking about them, and also two very bad constitutional provisions. One of them in the Weimar Constitution of Germany, post-Treaty of Versailles, and the other in the Meiji Constitution of Japan, as we'll see as I go along. But make no mistake about it, regardless of those two big bad decisions that I'm about to talk about, primary responsibility for the Second World War rests with this man here, especially in its European incarnation, and that, of course, is Adolf Hitler. The war was incomprehensible, at least in Europe, without some knowledge of Hitler's vision, his distorted vision of human life in human history. For Hitler, history was a matter of the strong in combat with the weak, and the destiny, and in fact the mission of the strong, the winners, to dominate the weak, in Hitler's view, the losers. And he saw that story in racial terms, so that in his view, the destiny of the German people, the Nordic people, would be to move east and subject so-called inferior populations to death or destruction or enslavement. And that would mean the eradication of the Jews of Eastern Europe, and that would mean the enslavement or death of any Slavs who happened to be living there along the way, whether they were Polish, Russian, or Ukrainian, or something else. There's no way to understand World War II without understanding that vision. So the question would have to be, how could that vision, how could this man come into a position of power where that vision could be put into practice? And as soon as that vision was put into practice, that meant war. This was a vision that demanded the expansion of Germany at the expense of others. And that, of course, would mean war, the Second World War. So the question maybe for us to begin with in the European part of our discussion is, how could someone like this come to power? Note, before we go any further, that Hitler's party, the Nazis, were technically called in English the National Socialist German Workers' Party, but there was nothing socialist about Hitler. Hitler detested socialism. He thought of socialism as a Jewish philosophy by which the weak could persecute the strong. He was anything but a socialist. And when he came to power in Germany, one of the first things he did was privatize industries that had been held by the state. So he detested socialism, and that word in the Nazi title means very little indeed. It just happens to be the name of the party that he took over in the early 1920s. And as far as the late 1920s were concerned, that party, the Nazi party, amounted to very little in Germany. 10 years after the Treaty of Versailles, at the time of the stock market crash in October of 1929, the Nazi party, after over 10 years of existence, only commanded 12 seats in the German Reichstag, the German parliament. There were over 500 seats in the Reichstag. The Nazis occupied 12 of them. It was the most minority of minority parties, commanding the support of a little over 2% of the German population. So how on earth could this man have come into power and put into effect this vision which demanded war, which demanded territorial expansion, to acquire the living room for the German people, the Lebensraum, that his philosophy demanded. And that story has a lot to do with the stock market crash of 1929. As we know, in October, the market fell precipitately in New York. And that was bad for the United States, but it was also bad for Germany, because as the German economy expanded in the 1920s, after the terrible inflation of 1923, that expansion was funded largely by American credit, American loans from American banks. In October of 1929, that credit source dried up. And all of a sudden, German banks had little money to lend, and German industry found itself in the position of having to lay people off. By 1930, the unemployment rate in Germany was 15%. This is teetering on the precipice of an economic emergency, in common with many of the other countries of Western Europe. But what made it worse in Germany, and this is important, is that by 1930, the German chancellor, that is the figure in charge of the German government, was this man right here, and that is Heinrich Brunner. Heinrich Brunner was a member of the Center Party in German politics, commanding many seats in the Reichstag, although not a majority. And he just happened to be chancellor in 1930 at a time when this emergency had to be dealt with. But what was he going to do? He was a very educated man, Heinrich Brunner, but unfortunately, part of that education involved several years of study at the London School of Economics. And I say unfortunately, because he seems to have learned all the wrong lessons there. As the economy got worse in 1930, as employment ushered itself into emergency situations, Brunner did not spend money, did not prime the pump and try to get people employed by public works in deficit spending, which is something Franklin Roosevelt would eventually do. Instead, Brunner went the opposite way. Brunner believed in cutting spending. Brunner raised taxes at a time of depression, precisely the thing he shouldn't have done. Brunner cultivated austerity, not priming the pump with deficit spending, as if John Maynard Keynes had never existed. And as a consequence, by 1931, Germany did not have a 15% unemployment rate. Germany had near 40% unemployment, an absolute catastrophe based on the only economy in Europe to pursue austerity in the Depression rather than growth through deficit spending. So this policy of Brunner was disastrous. No wonder he was called by the German people the Hunger Chancellor. But what made it worse was that under normal circumstances, by at least the beginning of 1932, when it became clear that this wasn't working, Brunner should have lost any support in the Reichstag that he had. And in fact, he did lose most of his support. So how could he stay in power through 1931 and into 1932 as things got worse? And the answer is bad constitutional provision number one. That man on the screen is the president of Germany in the early 1930s, Paul Ludwig Hans Anton von Beckendorf von Hindenburg, 85 years old, and very consequential to our story, because under the Weimar Constitution of 1919, at the end of World War I, under that Constitution, Article 48 provided that the president of Germany had the power to make any chancellor's proposals into law by emergency decree. So even though Brunner, as chancellor, could not command a majority of the Reichstag, it didn't matter as long as Hindenburg would sign anything Brunner wanted to do into law via this emergency decree provision, Article 48. It would become known as the infamous Article 48. Time and time again, these disastrous policies of Brunner were made law by Hindenburg going along via Article 48. And that happened so much that by 1932, the German Weimar Democratic Constitution didn't seem very democratic at all. It was Brunner and Hindenburg in partnership doing more or less what they wanted. No wonder Brunner was the subject of a famous motto going around in Germany, Brunner verordnet not, meaning Brunner decrees hardship. Brooning decrees hardship. Things were not good. Yet perhaps this might not have been so disastrous. By early 1932, Brooning had seen the light. Brooning was beginning to spend more money. Public works projects were happening. The unemployment rate was getting a little bit better. The economy was beginning to grow again, at least a little bit. Maybe we would never have heard much of Adolf Hitler, except for the fact that the next chapter of our story would involve the first major bad decision in our discussion tonight. Now, to set the stage, here's what was going on. By the spring of 1932, based upon this horrible series of economic privations, the Nazi Party had gone from 2% of the vote to nearly 40% of the vote. And they were the largest single party in the Reichstag. They had over 200 seats in the Reichstag, but they didn't have a majority, not yet. So there was no right of Hitler to form a government as chancellor. He's got no majority in the Reichstag. So how could it be that he would come into power, especially because things were beginning to get a little bit better? Enter very bad decision number one. And very bad decision number one, which would essentially put Hitler into power where he had no business being, was the product of this man here. Now that is Franz von Papen. Franz von Papen, as his name suggests, was a German aristocrat, and he was aristocratic to the core. Very proud of his Westphalian family, which went back all the way to the 13th century. To understand von Papen, we have to go back a bit before 1932, all the way back to August 1914, with the beginning of World War I. At that point, von Papen found himself in Washington, D.C., where he was military attaché to the German embassy. And in that capacity, he was able to receive all sorts of money from the German government to be used on sabotage activities in the United States. What the German government did not want is American factories producing things for the British here in the years before we entered World War I. So what von Papen would do is he'd take all that money and he put in war orders to American factories for things like gunpowder. He set up these dummy corporations that would do that, buy a bunch of gunpowder with no intention of ever actually coming up with the money. They just wanted to put orders in so the British couldn't get the gunpowder. And he was pretty successful at this for a while. And while he was at it, he began to plan an invasion of British Canada from the United States. And in his spare time, he was able to preside over a plot that, and some of you may know about this, placed a bomb on the bridge from Vanceboro, Maine into New Brunswick to disrupt the Canadian Pacific Railway. And that bomb actually went off, although I'm glad to say nobody was hurt. But his most famous initiative in 1914 and 1915, canal. So there you see it on your screen, a vitally important thoroughfare connecting Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. And if that had actually been disrupted, trade between the US and British Canada would have been badly hurt. Luckily, this plot was found out at the last minute. And when the authorities knew that von Papen was up to all this from his secure base in Washington, he was asked quite courteously to leave the United States and never come back. And that's what he did in 1915, ended up on the Western Front for a little while, and then went to Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, where he unsuccessfully tried to track down Lawrence of Arabia, and with great approval, massacre of one ally, where he unsuccessfully tried to track down Massacre. Not a very reputable character at all. But at this point, by the end of World War I, he decided to enter party politics, and so we find him a member of the Center Party in 1932. Now here's the story. Von Papen was a friend of Hindenburg. And when Hindenburg finally got fed up with Brooning, even as his policies were actually beginning to work, Hindenburg decided to get rid of Brooning, kicked him out of power as chancellor, and invited von Papen in as chancellor, even though von Papen had no support at all in the Reichstag. He was more or less on his own. He accomplished nothing as chancellor, was finally booted out as chancellor, but then, crucially, decided to come back in. So it is now the fall of 1932. The economy was getting a little bit better. In the November elections of 1932, Hitler's Nazi party lost seats. They went from 40% of the vote to about 33%. Still the largest party in the Reichstag, but maybe fading. Maybe they'd reached their peak. We'll never know, because von Papen hit upon a scheme to come back into power by persuading Hindenburg to name Hitler chancellor, so that von Papen, as vice chancellor, could control the Nazis from behind the scenes. That was von Papen's scheme. And he was able to get Hindenburg to agree to that in January of 1933. It was a grave miscalculation. Hindenburg went along. Hindenburg did it much like Hitler, but he went along, named Hitler as chancellor, confidently expecting that von Papen, the power behind Hitler, could engineer some kind of series of amendments that would make Germany once more, perhaps, into a monarchical regime. That might have been the idea. If so, it didn't work. Without a majority of support in the Reichstag, never having been voted into power by a majority of the German people, Hitler needlessly was put into power by Hindenburg on von Papen's scheming. And almost as soon as he could, as we know, Hitler put an end to democracy in Germany, and by the middle of 1933 was ruling more or less as a dictator. Von Papen was shuffled off to the side, never had any influence on Hitler, and eventually ended up as ambassador to Turkey a little bit later on. And that is how Hitler directly came to power. A bad decision, number one, von Papen's decision to try to scheme with Hindenburg to put Hitler into power at a time when perhaps the Nazis were beginning to lose some of their support. And once Hitler was into power, of course, his sick, distorted vision of history would become policy. And that would ultimately mean war, a drive to the east that would bring the British and French in as well, beginning in September of 1939. Could anything have stopped it? And we all know that the great conundrum of history is what would have happened in this respect if Daladier and Chamberlain had stood up to Hitler at Munich in the fall of 1938. What if they had refused to surrender the Sudetenland to Hitler? What if they had made good their guarantee to the Czechs, stood up for the entire territorial integrity of Czechoslovakia, and insisted on war rather than dishonor, to use Churchill's phraseology? We'll never know. Would Hitler have backed down at that point? Would there have been war anyway? We'll never know. I almost think as if it may not be that worthwhile to ask the question, because the fact was, the unhappy fact was, that the vast majority of the British and French people did not want war in 1938, not over the Sudetenland. I'm not sure there was much else, as far as Chamberlain was concerned, that he felt he could have done. A different man might have acted differently, but Chamberlain was not that man. And when he came back from Munich, never forget, he was showered with 40,000 messages congratulating him on having secured the peace. Only later, in March of 1939, when Hitler, against the Munich Agreement, seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, did Chamberlain understand that Hitler could not be trusted. And at that point, a working majority of the British people were prepared to endorse war rather than to give in further to Hitler. And that brings us to the beginning of the war in Europe. It's September 1st, 1939, as we all know. And at this point, early in the morning, the German army invaded Poland. It did so based upon what I believe to be a severe miscalculation. And the way to end our discussion of Europe for the time being is to talk about two elements of this decision to attack Poland in September of 1939 that I think are very crucial to understanding how the war would go from then on in. And the first one was a miscalculation based upon tactical elements of the German army. Most of the German high command did not want war until the early 1940s. maybe 1943. That's when Germany would have completely rearmed and would have been in a position to seize most of Eastern Europe and even at that point attack the Soviet Union if they wanted to. So 1943 was the target date of the German army. Hitler attacked on September 1st, 1939. Now what that meant, as you can see in this picture, was the German army was still largely horse-drawn. 80% of all transport for the German army throughout the war was done by horse. The British army was completely motorized. The German army depended upon horses, 2.7 million horses by the time the war was over. Consider how much more complicated it is to maintain an army by horse supply than truck. Horses need fodder. Horses have to be cared for. They need people to take care of them. Trucks are much more efficient, and trucks were not what the Germans had. One of the great unsung heroes of World War II would be this, and that's the famous Jimmy truck, the GMC Jimmy truck, produced by General Motors. 550,000 of these were produced by GM by the end of the war. No wonder Eisenhower, based upon the superiority of supply to the troops in the field, called the truck one of the 4 mechanized or technological things that helped win World War II. But that was not something the Germans could take advantage of. They simply did not have the oil reserves in 1939 to make not to have enough tanks ultimately to sustain the war against the Soviet Union. That's one element, a tactical mistake, attacking in 1939. Now, the other element is a bit strategic. When Hitler attacked Poland in 1939, he did so knowing that the British had guaranteed Polish territorial integrity. They had done that in April of 1939. Hitler attacked Poland anyway. He may not have thought the British would honor their pledge. He may have thought that with the Soviets on his side, Poland would be an easy conquest and the British would not join the war. If that is what he thought, it was wishful thinking, because when the British attacked Poland, within 48 hours, the British had declared war on Germany. Chamberlain honored his pledge. The importance of that was that with the British in the war, the Germans had created the same disastrous dynamic that had spelled doom for them in World War I. In 1914, the Germans had attacked Belgium. As a consequence, that attack, a strategic error, had brought the British into the war. And the way to defeat the British was to go out on the high seas and sink their merchant shipping. And it was that activity by 1917, the Battle of the North Atlantic, that had brought the United States into the war. And that 1939, it would be the same dynamic. Attacking Poland brought the British in. The way to defeat the British was to win the Battle of the North Atlantic. But in prosecuting that battle with its U-boat fleet, the Germans came into conflict with the U.S. Navy and drove Franklin Roosevelt into making common cause with the British by at least the spring of 1941. We remember that Roosevelt issued his famous shoot-on-sight order in the fall of 1941, so that American destroyers were in actual battle with German U-boats even before Pearl Harbor. So here is famously sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Iceland at the end of October 1941. And if things had been allowed to simply go like that, Hitler would have had to have faced the United States as an official belligerent probably by 1942. The same dynamic, bringing Britain into the war, would bring the US in as well, that had doomed the Germans in 1914, 1918. As it turned out, as we know, it was not the Battle of the North Atlantic that brought the US officially into a declared war. What happened in the meantime, of course, was Pearl Harbor. And that leads us to story number 2. And story number 2 has to begin with the First World War. Now, as you can see in this picture, the Japanese were on the Allied side in World War I. They were a long-standing British ally, and they honored that pledge by entering the war in August of 1914 on behalf of the British against the Germans. And the Japanese had a very war. They seized German possessions in the Central Pacific. They seized the Caroline Islands, so they had Yap Island, eventually famous as a Japanese naval base. The Japanese seized the Marshall Islands from the Germans, giving them in Wetak and other crucial bases. And most importantly, the Japanese seized most of the Marianas from the Germans, including the island of Saipan. And in 1914, when they seized it, nobody in the United States would have heard of Saipan. By 1944, everybody in the United States had heard of Saipan. And I bring it up now because, after all, among the many ships that fought in the Saipan campaign and took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea was the USS Lexington. So here it is, the famous USS Lexington, the blue ghost of the Pacific, that took part in the Saipan campaign in June of 1944. I'm sorry to say that there were no naval vessels in World War II named after Somerville. That's my city. But I do know that a member of the Star Trek Federation fleet was the USS Somerville. So we can take some solace in that. Now, continuing with the story, I was talking about Japan in World War I. They contributed a great deal to the Allied war effort. 20 Japanese war vessels actually served in the Mediterranean. They did duty, very important duty, rescuing Allied sailors who were in danger of drowning after attacks by German and Austrian U-boats. They saved 7,000 Allied sailors. Japanese naval vessels did. They performed escort duty and achieved a great deal of prestige in the Mediterranean. And as a matter of fact, in 1914, the Japanese Navy accomplished the first seaborne aerial strike from a seaborne vessel against a land installation. Planes took off from one of the Japanese ships and attacked German positions on the Shandong Peninsula in China, something that would be very common in World War II. And this was the first instance of it in naval warfare here in World War I. So they were on the victorious side in World War I. And so they were able to add, through the Treaty of Versailles, those islands in the Central Pacific, the Marshalls, the Carolines, and the Marianas, to what was already a considerable empire. So here's the Japanese Empire as it existed by the early part of the 20th century. You see at the bottom part of the screen, Formosa, now Taiwan, added to the Japanese Empire in 1895. Korea, which the Japanese officially took over in 1910. They had the Sakhalin Island, at least half of it, a little bit to the north. And important for our story, if you look in the middle part of the map, there's the South Manchurian Railway, a little bit north of the Korean Peninsula. And ever since 1905, the Japanese had had the right to station troops along the South Manchurian Railway to keep that open and free for commerce. Commerce eventually headed towards Japan and Korea. The army stationed there in South Manchuria was the Guandong Army. So keep that in mind because they're going to be important in just a second. So the Japanese had every reason to feel happy about this peace, except for one thing. And the one thing they were not happy about was that at the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese delegation proposed this language to be part of the ultimate treaty. It doesn't seem very controversial. All that language said was that in making decisions like immigration decisions, all countries that would be part of the new League of Nations would respect the principle of racial equality. It doesn't seem like too much to ask. And it was something the Japanese really wanted. They were acutely aware that many people, Japanese, other Asians, were looked down upon by Americans and Europeans. They wanted this as part of the treaty to, at least as a matter of international law, begin to fight against that old racist discriminatory trend. But that language did not get into the treaty. And the reason was Woodrow Wilson, our representative, didn't want it in the treaty. Woodrow Wilson was a racist himself. And he also feared that if that language was in the Treaty of Versailles, Southern Democratic segregationist senators would never vote for the treaty. And it would never get ratified. So Wilson would not support it. And in addition to Wilson, the Prime Minister of Australia would not support it, Prime Minister Billy Hughes. Hughes believed in the so-called White Australia policy. Only Europeans would be allowed to settle in Australia, no Asians, nobody else. So believing in White Australia and insisting that 95% of the Australian people, according to Hughes, also believed in White Australia, Hughes would not sign off on this provision either, and so it died, to the profound disappointment of the Japanese delegation. Nobody was more disappointed than this man here, a crucial figure in our story, Fumimaro Konoe. Konoe, if von Papen was pretty aristocratic, multiply that by 10. Konoe's family in Japan went back to the 8th century. He was part of the famous Fujiwara clan and had long been respected, the Konoe family, as one of the major families of the Japanese tradition and ultimately a power in Japanese politics. He was a man of fastidious, courteous manners, immensely proud of his past and immensely disillusioned by the idea that the United States would continue to insist on blocking this anti-racism provision in the Treaty of Versailles. Konoe was there in Paris when the treaty was being negotiated, and he really soured on the United States after this, although he did send his son to study at Princeton. There'd always be part of Konoe that would remember this and would resent it. But maybe that shouldn't have mattered that much. The fact was that after World War I, Japan was prospering. It had won the war. It had built up its industrial base during the war. It was selling all sorts of stuff to the Europeans, making plenty of money. The population was growing. The Japanese could feed that population because the Japanese were earning foreign currency to buy food because of all the material items they were selling. All was well, and Japan was moving ever forward into a modern Western-type democracy. It would, in fact, have universal suffrage by the middle of the 1920s. It was a party democracy based upon the Meiji Constitution of 1889. And modernizing and westernizing as it was, many people look forward to Japan becoming a force of peace rather than expansion as the years went on. But that reckoned without this, bad constitutional provision number 2. Bad constitutional provision number 1 was Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed Breen to rule by presidential decree, resulting in bad economic policies and ultimately resulting in a diminishing respect for democracy among the Germans. Why care about the Weimar Republic if everything just happens by presidential decree? But bad constitutional provision number 2 was the Meiji Constitution, which provided, ever since 1889, that the Navy in the Army of Japan would essentially have a co-equal position in Japanese power with the civilian prime minister in the cabinet. So if you were the head of the army or the Navy, you had an equal standing to advise the emperor along with the prime minister and the civilians. And the civilians in the government had no meaningful control over the army and the Navy. They could persuade them to go along with something. They couldn't order them, at least not easily. And that would prove to have dire consequences. Not many could see it coming, though. And maybe we would never have had to worry about this, except for something that happened at 11. There's that crucial date again, 1923. At 11:58 a.m., thousands of people in Tokyo and Yokohama were just sitting down to lunch when all of a sudden they felt the earth move, and the small tremor became larger tremors. A 7.9 Richter scale earthquake now struck Tokyo and Yokohama, and as buildings began to plummet to the ground, panic-stricken people rushed out of doors to seek safety any way they could. Tremors so powerful that the great Buddha at Kamakura was actually moved 3 feet by the moving of the earth. People were destroyed by falling buildings. People were crushed in narrow streets as they tried to get away. Some plunged into the Sumida River for safety, as in many cases they would do again in March of 1945 as the B-29s firebombed Tokyo. in the closing spring of World War II. But worst of all was the fire. With the collapsing buildings came fires. Walls of flame 300 feet tall. People were incinerated. 100,000 people at least, probably more, died in Tokyo and Yokohama on that day, September 1st, 1923. And the consequences were dramatic and catastrophic. In the immediate aftermath of this, the famous Kanto earthquake of 1923, the Japanese government, not wanting to talk about building codes and things like that, permitted many people to blame foreigners in Tokyo for this earthquake, especially Koreans, many of whom were living in Tokyo. And in the days after the Kanto earthquake, at least 7,000 Koreans were killed by vigilante mobs and even policemen who joined in the slaughter. Koreans, Japanese socialists in some cases were killed. Hundreds of Chinese were killed, sometimes because they were Chinese, sometimes because they were mistaken for Koreans. And what that meant was that this disaster was going to change things or help to change things in Japan. The idea began to take hold that maybe this terrible earthquake had happened because the Japanese were westernizing too quickly. Maybe this was a sign of heavenly disfavor. Maybe the Japanese had made a mistake in adopting democracy and other Western institutions. Maybe democracy was un-Japanese. Maybe the only way to earn favor with heaven again was to reject the West and cultivate traditional martial Japanese values. And we began to see that in different organizations founded to preach just these ideals after the earthquake. And you began to see postcards like this. People talked about the fact that the Asakusa district in Tokyo, a famous entertainment district, was badly hurt by the earthquake. Maybe that means that ideas of immorality, too much luxury, too much entertaining, maybe all that had to go by the wayside. Maybe the Japanese had to get back to basics. The Ginza, the famous shopping district, had also been badly hurt. Maybe that meant Japanese were too materialistic. Maybe that meant the time had come to turn back on a Western luxury and Western goods and cultivate more traditional so-called Japanese ideas and virtues. So you began to see cartoons like this. Now the catfish, which you see on the left, is the old Japanese symbol for earthquakes. And the meaning of this cartoon that you see here is catfish rectifies evil trends in society. Catfish rectifies evil trends in society. And what this catfish, the earthquake, is doing is tearing off an expensive fabric from this woman, and the fabric is labeled ostentation in vanity. Ostentation in vanity. In other words, many began to believe that the time had come to go back to basics in traditional Japanese ideas. And for some people, that meant war and that meant conquest. And nobody believed that more than members of the Guandong Army. Remember them? That's the army that occupied the South Manchurian Railway. And a leading figure of the Guandong Army was a guy named Ishiwara, Kanji Ishiwara. Ishiwara and many officers of the Guandong Army believed in this idea of rejecting Westernization and democracy in Japan. And they also could see, as the 1920s went on, that Western orders for Japanese goods were diminishing. The Japanese weren't selling as much abroad. The civilian governments experienced scandals after the Tokyo earthquake, which was a great strain, after all, on the Japanese economy. And as time went on, people in the rural areas of Japan, and the army was largely culled from rural areas, began to go hungry as Japanese industry could not sell enough to earn the money to buy food for a growing population. So how to solve this economic problem, how to solve the moral problem raised by the Great Kanto earthquake, maybe Ishiwara believed the same thing would solve both. Why not expand beyond the South Manchuria Railway and take over all Manchuria? So here's Manchuria. It looked something like this in 1931. It's that area up to upper right-hand part of the map, Manchuria was technically a part of China, but this area, the size of California and Texas combined, rich in minerals and industrial potential, was now seized by the Guangdong Army, led in this case by officers believing in this need to return to old moral ideas, especially Colonel Kishiwara. So what they did was they set off a bomb right about here in the South Manchurian Railway. The bomb did almost no damage, but they set it off. And of course, what they said was the Chinese had set off the bomb, an attack against the Guangdong Army itself. So once they said that, the Guangdong Army expanded, and by early 1932, had taken all of Manchuria. Keep in mind that this was not ordered by Tokyo. The Japanese government in Tokyo had nothing to do with this. The Guangdong Army on the scene in Manchuria did this on its own. They took over the whole place. For many, the first act of the Second World War, September 1931. And the thing to do now was for the Japanese government to disavow this, to order the Guangdong Army to retreat. And this man, the Prime Minister of Japan, who you can see on the screen, somebody who'd been elected to the Japanese Diet repeatedly, 17 separate times, desperately wanted to do just that. And he began to make motions towards reining in the military and persuading them to call back the Guangdong Army and to give up Manchuria. He tried, but remember, he had no authority to order the military to do anything. That was the Meiji Constitution. All he could do was try to persuade them. But while he was trying to persuade them, 11 young members of the Japanese Navy went into his apartment in Tokyo, murdered him in cold blood. His last words, the Prime Minister's last words were, if I could only speak to you, you would understand. If I could only speak to you, you would understand. To which one of his assassins responded, dialogue is useless. The usual retort of a tyrant and an assassin. Dialogue is useless. And that was the end of Kiyoshi Inukai, maybe the last man who could have called a halt to this kind of aggression. And what every Japanese prime minister now knew is the very attempt to rein in the military might cause their death, might prove their assassination. This was the famous May 15th incident of 1932, and no civilian prime minister ever forgot it. But again, and this is a common theme, maybe things didn't have to get much worse. The Japanese had occupied Manchuria, courtesy of the Guangdong Army, but they had not gone into China proper. So most of China, the vast hinterland of China, remained under the control of Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government, various warlords, and a bit to the north, elements of the Communist Party. But the Japanese did nothing more than take over Manchuria. There were border incidents here and there, scuffles, skirmishes, but not much. Not the kind of thing that would involve us calling it a war. And in fact, while we're on the topic, when Manchuria was taken over, the Japanese always called it the Mukden incident. Mukden being the place nearby which that bomb had gone off. The Mukden incident, they didn't want to call it a war, they wanted to call it an incident, and they always did that because if it's a war, different people might not sell you the material you need, including oil from the United States. So they didn't call it a war, they always called it an incident, as it remains to this day in many historical texts. But again, like I said, maybe this wouldn't have amounted to much. And in fact, for the next 6 years, there were no further attempts at Japanese expansion in Asia. And that could have been the tale. Maybe there would have been no Pearl Harbor had it not been for Konoe. So we last left him objecting to the inequality provision that ended up being in the Treaty of Versailles. And here he is again, called to power as prime minister in June of 1937. At that point, there didn't seem to be any real reason for Japan to expand and fight another war. It was growing in international prestige. These two men here on your screen captured the imagination of the world, two Japanese flyers, by taking off from Tokyo and landing in Britain 51 hours later, setting a new world record for that amount of flying space in that short a time. They were greeted by crowds in Europe wherever they went, heroes in Japan and in Europe. Their plane, by the way, was named by a contest in a leading Tokyo newspaper. 500,000 people voted in the contest what to name their plane, and their plane was actually named Kamikaze, which would, of course, have very different connotations several years later. Both of these young men, heroes of Japan, would die in the terrible conflict to follow. They would die after 1941. Nobody knew that yet, though. All they knew was that Japan had these two heroes around the world, and Japan was going to host the 1940 Olympics. That was a big deal. The very first Asian Olympics were going to be held in Tokyo. So there was every reason to think that despite all this, Japan perhaps would not pose much of a threat to the rest of the world, except for very bad decision number two. So very bad decision number one was von Papen believing that he could put Hitler into power via Hindenburg and then control Hitler. Very bad decision number two was made by Konoe. And that has to do with this place right here. That is the famous Zhongdu Bridge over the Yongding River, 10 miles southwest of Beijing, better known to Westerners as the Marco Polo Bridge. It actually dates from the 17th century, but Marco Polo had seen an earlier version of the bridge in the very much earlier in the 13th century. So it's always known as the Marco Polo Bridge. Famous for its beauty, famous for the 400-odd stone lions, each in different poses that line each side of the surface of the bridge, a real architectural landmark. In 1937, and ever since 1900, the Japanese had had the right, under the treaty that settled the Boxer Rebellion, to station a garrison of troops in the neighborhood of Beijing. Perfectly legal. As a result of the settlement of the Boxer crisis, the Chinese agreed to that. And the Japanese had several thousand troops around Beijing. A detachment of that army was by the Marco Polo Bridge on the night of July 7, 1937, 7/7/37. That night, they went on maneuvers. They came into contact with a small Chinese force. Shots were exchanged, nothing unusual. That kind of thing happened a lot, never amounted to much. And then one Private Shimura of the Japanese army went on the most fateful bathroom break in all human history. He disappeared, went somewhere to go to the bathroom. The Japanese didn't know where he was. They thought the Chinese had taken him. They demanded the right to search a nearby city. That was refused. The Japanese opened fire more. Now you had a battle, where before you had a skirmish. And Shimura showed up 24 hours later. He simply had lost his way. None of this was necessary, and none of it should have been a big deal. And in fact, the local commanders arranged a truce not long after this, by the second week in July. We should never have heard of this Marco Polo Bridge incident, but we did hear of it because Konoe made very big mistake number two. As Japanese prime minister, he went to the army and he persuaded the army to commit more troops to North China and Shanghai to heighten hostilities and go into battle against Chinese army elements. What he seems to have thought was that the Japanese could win a quick victory. The Japanese could achieve more of North China under their control, and that would achieve for Konoe more economic influence in East Asia. That might have been what he was thinking. We'll never quite know because Konoe didn't talk much about his motives. All we know is that this juncture, July 1937, Konoe talked the army into doing what it hadn't even thought of, what it was rather reluctant to do, but did anyway, and that was actually commit more troops to China. And the result, sad to say, was one of the most calamitous horrid conflicts in all human history. The Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945. This is Shanghai. If Konoe thought Chiang Kai-shek would roll over, make a deal, and recognize Japanese influence in North China, he was badly mistaken. At Shanghai, the Chinese lost 300,000 men defending the city. It is often known as the Chinese Stalingrad. They didn't give up until 300,000 had died. The Japanese suffered terribly in taking Shanghai, but now that they had taken Shanghai, there was no turning back. Up the Yangtze Valley they went, as you can see in this map, towards Nanking, the capital of China. At that point, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek abandoned Nanking. They had no choice. The Chinese occupied it, and we know what happened next. Nobody, perhaps 100,000 dead in Nanking, at least 20,000 women raped in one of the most horrid incidents of the entire Second World War. What was supposed to be a limited engagement was turning into a major war. And the Chinese showed no sign of backing down in making a deal. Here at Taizhong in 1938, they made a stand and they ruined much of the Japanese 5th Division, the biggest defeat suffered by Japan in hundreds of years. And most crucially, the next year, still in 1938, in June of 1938, as the Japanese attempted to capture Wuhan, one of the great cities of central China. As they were moving up the Yangtze, moving ever more slowly, Japanese elements from the north of the Yellow River, decided to move south to take Wuhan from the north. To prevent that, Chiang Kai-shek made a fateful decision. To delay the Japanese army, he decided to break the dikes which for hundreds of years had held in the Yellow River. They tried to break one dike, it was too strong. They tried to break another, it was too strong. Finally, the Chinese arrived at this place, Huangpu, and they found a major dike that they could blow up. So under the anxious eyes of Japanese infantry on the north bank of the Yellow River, the dike was blown up. In much of Hainan in Jiangsu province, millions of acres were inundated by the Yellow River. This was one of the very worst man-made ecological disasters in all history. At least 800,000 Chinese died by the flooding of the Yellow River. They died by drowning, they died by starvation, they died by disease, they died in many cases horribly. And it accomplished very little militarily. The Japanese captured Wuhan anyway in October of 1938. But what it showed, as horrifying as it was, and militarily needless in the end, as this was, what it showed was that Chiang Kai-shek was not going to make a deal. And that the China invasion, the China incident, as the Japanese always called it, was a quagmire, and a disastrous quagmire for the Japanese. China is one of the largest countries in the world. They were now trapped into gaining territory, but never bringing the Chinese army to a decisive battle and never forcing Chiang Kai-shek to make a deal. The war went on, and it went on, and it went on. And in the battle for their independence, the nationalist Chinese and Chiang Kai-shek were supported by the United States. The United States had long had sympathy with China. We had long believed that no one power should dominate China, which is precisely what the Japanese have been doing because of Konoe's miscalculation. What should have been a 3-month intervention had turned into a disastrous quagmire from which there was no exit. The only thing to do, as long as Chiang Kai-shek was not going to make a deal with the benefit of US aid, the only thing to do was for the Japanese to withdraw from China, at least withdraw north of the Yellow River. But that is precisely what they could not do. No Japanese civilian prime minister could order the army to withdraw. Not now. And the army would not withdraw. Their prestige was at stake. Their stature was at stake. They had to fight to the end, to the end, and to the end, even though tens of thousands were dying. And it is this dynamic, the need somehow to resolve the China incident, as the Japanese put it, that led to Pearl Harbor. In 1940, disastrously, as a way to intimidate the United States, maybe getting us to stop our support of China, the Japanese signed the Axis Pact with Germany. And in 1941, to try to cut off Western aid into southern China, they seized northern French Indochina, Hitler having already knocked France out of the war in June of 1940. And then, just as disastrously, the Japanese seized all of southern Indochina, and that is what led the United States to cut off Japanese assets in the United States, which meant the Japanese could no longer buy oil from the United States. That meant they had 2 years left of oil to work with, and that made them decide to seize the oil fields of the East Indies. And they felt they could not do that without attacking the United States. Konoe had formed a cabinet in which the military and civilians couldn't outvote one another. They both had to be consulted. And with the military not backing down, the decision was made in September of 1941 to attack the United States, ultimately at Pearl Harbor. Konoe left power in October. He really wanted to forestall this at the last minute. He tried to meet with Roosevelt in Juneau, Alaska, to work out some kind of a deal, but that was impossible. The United States insisted that there was no deal with Japan as long as the Japanese army was in China. And the Japanese army had to stay in China because of this quagmire that the Japanese had created, and the fact that the army simply refused to lose the prestige that they thought would have been occasioned by any withdrawal from China. Thus it was that having occupied, as I said, Indochina, in October of 1941, this man, Hideki Tojo, came into power in Japan, and he was the one who gave the final order to attack Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. He did so even though an independent research institute, objectively looking at the facts, known as the Total War Research Institute in Tokyo, the Total War Research Institute, had told Tojo that fall that if the Japanese attacked the United States, the chances of a Japanese victory were literally zero. Literally zero. The Japanese, according to this institute, looking at all the gaming, all the facts and figures, the Japanese would necessarily lose this war. And Tojo knew that. The Japanese government knew that. They plunged into war anyway. How could they have done so? Well, remember 1939, when Hitler attacked Poland, Hitler was hoping that the British wouldn't enter the war. That was wishful thinking. And there was no particularly good reason by then to think that. And Tojo and the Japanese leadership staked the lives of literally millions of people on wishful thinking. They believed that no matter what the facts showed, no matter what rationality showed, something might happen, something unexpected that would allow the Japanese to prevail with most of their empire intact. Wishful thinking would produce the catastrophe of the war, beginning for the Japanese against the United States in 1941. So based upon Konoe's inexplicable decision to make a war out of that Marco Polo Bridge incident, 4 years later, we got Pearl Harbor, where on the morning of December 7th, as we all know, the fabled torpedo bombers, the Sea Eagles of the Japanese combined fleet, flew over Oahu and attacked the Pacific Fleet there at anchor, precipitating the declaration of war by the United States. And the next day, don't forget, Hitler declared war on the United States, something he did not need to do. He did it anyway. He declared war on the United States, December 8th, 1941, thus bringing the two strands of World War II together, Europe and Asia. We all know the rest of the story, and different elements of your lecture series will have to do with the rest of the story. I did want to point out, though, that Franz von Papen would live through the war, and he would be put on trial by the Nuremberg Tribunal for war crimes because of his role in bringing Hitler to power. So this is, you might not be able to see my cursor, but there's von Papen. He's in the middle of the second row there among the Nuremberg defendants. Von Papen was acquitted of war crimes, but I'm happy to say that he was sentenced to hard labor by a German domestic court a little bit later, and lived for several more years after leaving prison in relative comfort. I think he only died in 1970. And as far as Konoe is concerned, he made very bad decision number 2. He would live through the war. In 1944, he went to Hirohito. He did his best to try to see if there could be, even at this point, a negotiated settlement. By that time, of course, it was way too late. Hirohito dismissed him presumptuously. And what ultimately happened to him was he lived to see the devastation wrought by this war, by the B-29s, and ultimately by the atomic bombs on Japanese cities. He was about to be tried as a war criminal too, but he took potassium cyanide before that could happen, and he died at the end of 1945. So that is my presentation for this evening. And I understand that maybe there may be a few questions, although we're running out of time, but maybe if anybody has a couple that they'd like to share with all of us, maybe this would be a good time to do that.
Great.
So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was wonderful. So we do have a couple of questions. If anyone has anything that they're interested in asking, now would be a good time to put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But we do have a couple, and I see that someone has had their hand raised for a while. So Stephen, I'm going to attempt to unmute your microphone if you would like to speak rather than talk, and we'll see if that works. Did you have anything you wanted to ask?
We have some questions in the chat.
We do, yes. I saw that one had come up first. If it is easier for you to type that.
Yeah.
Oh, we just wanted to say great talk. Thank you, Stephen.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Well, we do have one question here. Mark's question is, despite the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, do you think that World War II may not have happened were it not for the Great Depression? And yes, I do think that. I think that the Great Depression is crucial to any story of how we got World War II. What happened with the Treaty of Versailles was that little by little, the worst parts of that treaty were being eased. We always remember German reparations. The Germans were excused from reparations beginning in 1931. At least temporarily, they didn't have to pay anymore. And as far as their territorial losses, they only amounted to about 10% of German territory. The Germans still hung on to East Prussia, most of East Prussia, very important to traditional elements of the German soul. So as long as the reparations had been eased, which they had been by 1930, I don't think the Treaty of Versailles would have precipitated another war, especially as long as security arrangements that were crucial to the League of Nations were observed, as they could have been observed if everybody had believed in what the treaty meant to do. So it's radical elements ultimately coming to power that would destroy those territorial arrangements. And those elements would not have come to power were it not for the misery of the Depression. So I think what would have happened is over the years, some aspects of the treaty would have been revised, as in fact, some aspects had been revised as of the early 1920s. And I don't think it would have threatened world peace in the long term. And I think there's another question here. Another question, the naval agreement. The naval agreement in the wake of World War I, which limited Japan to 5 battleships carriers versus 8 for the US, a major factor on the road to war. Yeah, it was in the sense that many important elements of the Japanese Navy really chafed under those restrictions. So for those of you who may be wondering, after the war, in order to help keep the peace and prevent a ruinous competition in Navy buildup, the major powers agreed that the British in the United States ought to have parity in terms of capital ships, especially battleships, but the Japanese would be limited to fewer capital ships. The idea being that Japan was a regional power, not an international one, like Britain and the United States. So why would they need as many ships as we did? Now, the bad thing about that was that when important parts of the Japanese military began to cultivate this traditional warrior ethos, as many of them did beginning in the mid-1920s, that Japanese Navy and other Japanese policymakers. I don't think it did much good. And the bad thing about it, it was easily evaded. It didn't do much good anyway. Instead of building battleships, all the Japanese could do was build heavy cruisers, which were almost as powerful as battleships, and technically within the provisions of the naval ratio. So it might have been a good idea in conception, but I think the results were worse than anybody could have conceived. And we can go maybe to another question here. What mistakes did Italy make? Well, go ahead. Anybody? Well, one question was actually interesting. What mistakes did Italy make that helped to lead to the war? I think probably the big mistake was this, providing a bad example for Hitler. Because the way Mussolini came to power, of course, was by gathering this private army of his and marching them at a crucial moment on Rome and overawing the civilian authorities, essentially intimidating the King of Italy, King Victor Emmanuel, from inviting Mussolini to form a government. So Mussolini's playbook was copied by Hitler, and he formed his own private army, the SA, and he used the SA to do just what Mussolini did in Italy, which was attack his foes, especially socialists and communists, creating disorder in German streets and leading many industrialists, bankers to believe, as of 1932, that maybe the thing to do was actually support von Papen in this idea that the way to stop the disturbances was to actually bring Hitler into power. So I don't think the government of Italy was terribly responsible for much of what I've talked about, but I think Mussolini's example in the 20s was a very, very sorry one and an unfortunate one because Hitler followed it. As far as Mussolini is concerned, he probably did make a mistake in permitting the Anschluss in 1938. If Mussolini had stood up to Hitler, Austria being on Italy's border, if Mussolini had insisted on preserving Austria as an independent state, I don't think Hitler would have attempted the Anschluss when he did, and that would have delayed very much his agenda for Eastern Europe. But Mussolini didn't do that, and the rest, unfortunately, is history. And maybe we also have at least one more, although we are running out of time.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, Stephen did manage to write his question in the chat. He's curious what the role was of the Soviet border in Japan's capitulation in 1945. He says the documentary by Oliver Stone implies that the Soviet threat was more important in the surrender than the A-bomb.
Mm-hmm. There is a school of thought to that extent. So remember that in August of 1945, the Russians finally joined the war in the Pacific. They invaded Manchuria. And what that meant when the Manchurian army disintegrated in the face of the Russian assault was that all Korea was now open in much of the Japanese position in North China. So there is a school of thought that that might have been as important as anything else in leading the Japanese to surrender. I rather think that the atomic bombs might have been more important because it was those bombs that allowed the Japanese leadership, especially the emperor, to actually have a position where they could say there's no longer any use in fighting. So this is something that we can contest. This is something that we can fight against. This is something new. So to me, the surrender when it happened, and I could be wrong about this, had more to do with the bomb than with the invasion of Manchuria, as important as that was. To me, the really interesting thing about the Soviet Union with the story that I've been telling is that a very important part of the Japanese military had thought that the thing to do was not go south and attack the East Indies, ultimately the United States. The thing to do is to go north and attack the Soviet Union. And if they'd done that in June of 1941, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, who knows what would have happened with history? Could have been very different. They didn't do that, however, and one reason they didn't do that, remember, was that in 1939, the Soviet army, the Red Army, under Zhukov, had given the Japanese a bloody nose in Mongolia at the Battle of Nomonhan. And the Japanese never forgot that, especially those in charge of the Japanese civilian elements. They didn't want anything like that. And leading members of the Japanese army also thought that probably that was not the thing to do. So although some members of the army wanted to go north after Nomonhan, they were in the minority and they agreed to go south. But if the Japanese had won that battle at Nomonhan, they might have seen the Soviet Union as a pushover. They might have joined the war in 1941. And if they'd done that, Moscow probably would have fallen. One reason Moscow held out in December of 1941 was that Stalin felt free to remove Siberian divisions from facing the Japanese east to face the Germans in front of Moscow. If he hadn't done that, the city would have fallen. History would have been very different and very much worse. But it didn't happen. And we have maybe the Battle of Nomonhan to thank for that in 1939. Okay, now let's see. That might be all we have.
I think we're on, the last one. Was Hitler actually sentenced to death for the Munich revolt in the 1920s and pardoned by Hindenburg?
What happened, I thought, was he wasn't sentenced to death. He was sentenced to a very comfortable confinement. So one bad thing about the Weimar Republic was that most of the judges were old monarchists. They were all believers in the Hohenzollern monarchy. They had very little allegiance to Weimar. So what happened was Hitler was convicted of what amounted to a treasonous uprising in Munich. I hadn't heard that at any time he got the death sentence. That might be true, but all I know is he served time in prison, had a very nice couch, had a nice library, had visitors all the time, had very good food, wasn't much of a confinement. And it was in prison, of course, that he inflicted upon the world Mein Kampf. That's when he wrote most of the book. And he got out, I can't remember now, after maybe 18 months or something like that. So it wasn't much of anything. But I might have the details wrong, but that confinement was nowhere near the ordeal that a lot of people think it was. And maybe...
I think that was it, actually. There were some very detailed and great questions.
Yes, thank you.
A lot more information that we could, a lot more in-depth information that we could get out of that. That was wonderful.
It's going to take us about a year or so to really digest all this information. That was a tremendous lesson.
Yes, thanks to Carol Sue. She said that it was such an Olympic history that it could be used in place of a semester in college.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's very nice of all of you. And I thank the Lexington Historical Society and the Lexington Veterans Association again for making this possible. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for coming to speak with us, Dan, and thank you so much to Linda and to George for helping out. Before everyone goes, I'm going to just drop a link in the chat box again to our website if anyone is interested in making this a pay-per-view program. And I'm also going to drop the link to the World War II website that George has been working on so that you can see some more of the events that are coming down the line.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Good night.
Any other words that you three would like to leave us with?
No, just to say thank you so much for tuning in and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
John Breen.